All right. Now, item number 7. Let's go straight to that one. Commercial society coordinates the activities of strangers and to gain their selfish advantage. They must fulfill the needs of others. The point of this is really as much philosophical and historical as anything else. What's important about this is Adam Smith's reliance and Adam Smith's call to us to be comfortable with a personal individual reliance in our own lives with the reality of our self-interest. What Adam Smith is saying is that new commercial society, capitalism, rises out of our own self-interest, uh, closely associated with greed, right? It is out of our self-interest that we try to accumulate more private property, right? And that's why we enter into the market. We are pursuing our self-interest. Now, the reason why this is a big deal at the time is because, well, it was a big deal at the time, but it's because stop and think about our discussion about what life and what culture was like during the medieval time, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. To be interested in oneself was seen as conceited. The life worth living, the Christ-like life, is not one that is wrapped up in the self. It is one that is concerned about giving of oneself to the other. So one of the great transitions, and this is one of the psychological transitions that happens in Europe, that I argue necessarily had to happen for capitalism to rise in the way that it did. One of the great psychological shifts had to be one of going from seeing self-interest as being bad to seeing self-interest as being natural and good and even virtuous. And that was a particularly big move at the time. I won't get into it very much, but about 60 years before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, this other Englishman, Bernard Mandeville, wrote this book, a couple of versions of it, and the more common version that we know of is called The Fable of the Bees. And Mandeville makes the argument that private vice, that personal self-interest, is not bad. In fact, personal self-interest could become a public good. Society can benefit from individuals pursuing and acting out of their own individual self-interest, as opposed to hundreds of years, if not more, where the thinking was society does better where everyone operates primarily on the basis of what is in the best interest of my Christian brother and sister, right? So it's a very different way of seeing things. Mandeville lays down that groundwork. He takes all of the hits. People become maybe not terribly comfortable, but less uncomfortable with the notion that in modern society, perhaps communities can thrive best when people are pursuing their own individual self-interest. So just as John Locke had to settle once and for all, at least in the Western tradition, the primacy of private property in order for Adam Smith to make the moves that he made in Wealth of Nations, Bernard de Mandeville, much less known than John Locke, he had to lay the foundation for a shift in Europe's orientation about the relationship between the individual and the rest of society. And increasingly, it was okay to say, my society is better off when I pursue my self-interest, as opposed to my society is better off when I give of myself completely to the people around me. Because it's in the pursuit of self-interest in commercial society and capitalism that we harness, again, the way that I characterize it, that we harness our self-interest and our greed, the profit motivation, right? Our desire for stuff and then more stuff, right? And it's this passion, Plato described it as this passion, this hunger inside of us, right? That is unleashed with the psychological mind shift that suggests it's okay to pursue your self-interest. And Adam Smith is saying, in fact, it is okay to pursue your self-interest. But at this point, I have to layer in a caveat that I think is often missing in the historical understanding of Adam Smith and his position on self-interest. Because I do not believe, as has been often and long taught since the first classic economic theorists after Adam Smith, again, Malthus, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, part of the tradition of misunderstanding Adam Smith and taking him out of context is this notion that Adam Smith is somehow the great proponent, the great celebrator, the great apologist for unbridled, unmitigated, self-conceited self-interest. That's not the Adam Smith that one reads when one actually reads The Wealth of Nations. And it sure as hell is not the Adam Smith who speaks gloriously about the moral imperative in the theory, or rather in the theory of moral sentiments. What Adam Smith is suggesting, rather, is that we all have our own self-interest. We all have our own concern about our individual well-being and our own condition in life, and we need to acknowledge that, and we can celebrate that, and we can use this innate desire to better our condition. But Adam Smith never suggested that self-interest is to be experienced at the expense of the other. In fact, Adam Smith, within The Wealth of Nations, and quite clearly more emphatically earlier in Theory of Moral Sentiments, is very clear that that moral restraint, which is the subject of my ninth and final takeaway here, which is also very often forgotten about the real Adam Smith. Moral restraint on an individual level is absolutely imperative in order to make the most of one's individual concern for one's condition, one's self-interest, without succumbing to greed and avarice and the other vices that Adam Smith condemns in both Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments. And so I think Adam Smith is very mindful of Plato's concern about this passion that we have of greed, but I think Adam Smith is quite optimistic, and he is quite Aristotelian in his belief that we can and are able to say, no, that's enough. I need to control myself. This is not appropriate behavior. I am making a decent living. There's no need for me to go overboard. I must exercise the requisite self-control, the ability to self-regulate my behavior, and to identify and control my predisposition for excesses. I must be able to show the term that Adam Smith used very often is self-command. I must be able to show the moral restraint that is requisite so that my self-interest doesn't get out of control. That's the Adam Smith that I see in each of his two masterpieces, but particularly when one seeks to understand the beauty of his two great works put together. But again, I want to emphasize, because you may have already been exposed to this, what I am arguing is a mischaracterization of Adam Smith. Adam Smith is to this day is often held up as a great proponent of self-interest. He was, but not unmitigated, unrestrained self-interest. Adam Smith was trying to suggest to us that we need to find and strike and maintain an appropriate balance. And so there's self-interest, but there's moral restraint. And he argued for both. And so I wanted to introduce that because Adam Smith, in Wealth of Nations, he finally provides Europe that is increasingly cool with having private property, in fact, increasingly interested in having more and more, but is also increasingly comfortable with the notion that it's okay to pursue your own individual self-interest. You can see, given this shift and the allure and the enticement of increasing material wealth that was blossoming in Europe, I think one can see how easy it must have been for people after Adam Smith to pick and choose what he wrote and to focus on those things that celebrate the acquisition of wealth, particularly if you're well on your way already to acquiring a lot of wealth, and downplaying or omitting intentionally, knowingly or not, the moral admonitions that Adam Smith offers us in The Wealth of Nations, and clearly more particularly in Theory of Moral Sentiments. But having said all of that, there is no question that The Wealth of Nations represents, in the 18th century in Europe, a great transition point from a psychological perspective, the old psychological perspective of seeing self-interest in the way that it was typically characterized at the time, and the way that Adam Smith characterized it in both Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments, self-love. Self-interest at the time was more often referred to as self-love, and love of self in the old days was seen as bad, right? The Christian way to live is love of the other. And so love of self was very controversial for a long time. By the time Adam Smith writes Wealth of Nations, people are more comfortable with the notion of being okay with loving oneself to some degree. After all, it's part of the humanistic tradition, isn't it? To celebrate the inherent value of the individual. So once you begin to celebrate your own inherent value, then you become you become acquainted with the reality that I am to be loved. I am to be celebrated. I should enjoy comforts in life. And Adam Smith really takes that to a whole nother level and makes it not just palatable, but makes it a core concept in the modern world, and it truly energizes the movement toward self-gratification and self-achievement through the accumulation of material wealth that the Wealth of Nations promises is there to be had.